Welcome to the world of daily life stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Enjoy listening. The unexpected kindness. Chris sat perched on his bike, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow over the neighborhood. It was one of those perfect days, when the world felt like it was moving in slow motion, and everything seemed to be at peace. The streets were quiet, except for the occasional chirp of birds, and the warm breeze gently tousled his hair as he pedaled through his familiar route. He loved these moments when time seemed to stand still, and he could simply enjoy the world around him. Today, however, something caught his eye that made him stop in his tracks. As he rounded the corner of Maple Street, he saw Mrs. Garcia, the elderly woman who lived in the small yellow house with the beautiful garden, standing outside her front door. She was bent over an old, bulky television set, her face drawn in frustration as she fiddled with the knobs. Chris had known Mrs. Garcia for as long as he could remember. She had always been kind to him, greeting him with a warm smile whenever he passed by her house. He often caught glimpses of her sitting by her window, enjoying her favorite TV shows, and sometimes she'd wave at him or even call out to ask about his day. But lately, something had changed. She seemed withdrawn, quieter than usual, and Chris had noticed she spent less time tending to her roses, which had always been her pride and joy. Concern flickered in Chris's heart as he slowed his bike. He had a soft spot for Mrs. Garcia, and seeing her struggle with her TV was not something he could ignore. He wondered what was wrong. Maybe it was just the TV, perhaps she had trouble fixing it herself. He knew his way around electronics fairly well, thanks to his dad, who worked as a technician. If it was something simple, maybe he could help her out. He steered his bike toward the curb and came to a stop in front of the house. As he got closer, he heard Mrs. Garcia muttering softly to herself, her hands trembling slightly as she turned the knobs on the TV, as if willing it to work. Chris didn't want to startle her, so he called out gently, "Hi, Mrs. Garcia. Is everything okay?" She looked up, surprised, her wrinkled face softening into a smile when she saw him. "Oh, hello, Chris," she replied, her voice a mixture of warmth and frustration. "I'm afraid this old TV of mine has finally given up. I was hoping to watch my favorite show this afternoon, but it's completely gone out on me," she said, gesturing helplessly at the silent television screen. Chris felt a pang of empathy. He knew how much Mrs. Garcia loved her afternoon shows. She'd often talk to his mom about the latest episodes of whatever drama she was watching. Watching TV seemed to be one of her few pleasures, and it broke Chris's heart to see her disappointed. He thought for a moment, then made a decision. "Maybe I can help," he offered. "I'm pretty good with electronics. Do you mind if I take a look?" Mrs. Garcia's eyes brightened with hope, and a faint smile tugged at her lips. "Oh, Chris, would you? I'd be so grateful. I just don't know what to do anymore." She stepped aside, clearing the space in front of the TV, and Chris parked his bike, setting it down against the fence. As Chris knelt down next to the TV, he felt a sense of purpose wash over him. He wasn't just fixing an old piece of technology, he was helping someone who needed it. As he inspected the back of the television, he could see that the wires were a tangled mess. Mrs. Garcia hovered nearby, wringing her hands nervously, her eyes never leaving his movements. "Don't worry, Mrs. Garcia," Chris said, offering her a reassuring smile. "I'll do my best to fix it for you." He began working carefully, checking the connections and testing the power cords. There was something calming about the rhythm of his movements, and he focused completely on the task at hand, tuning out the world around him. Mrs. Garcia watched in awe as Chris worked. It amazed her how someone so young could have such skill and confidence. Her hands, once busy with flowers and household tasks, were now still at her sides, and she allowed herself to relax a little. She hadn't realized how much she needed this moment, not just to have the TV fixed, but to have someone, anyone, take the time to help her. Over the past few months, she'd felt increasingly isolated, her late husband's absence weighing heavily on her heart. Her children lived far away, and though they called every so often, it wasn't the same as having someone nearby. After a few minutes of working in silence, Chris sat back on his heels, a look of concentration on his face. "I think I found the problem," he said. There was a loose connection in the wires that was preventing the TV from turning on. "Let me just reconnect this, and we should be good." Mrs. Garcia's eyes widened in anticipation. She had almost given up hope of ever watching her beloved programs again. As Chris worked with delicate precision, he could hear the TV crackle to life, the screen flickering before settling into a clear picture. "Oh my goodness!" Mrs. Garcia gasped, clapping her hands in delight. "You did it, Chris. You really did it." Chris smiled, feeling a rush of pride. "It wasn't too difficult," he said modestly, wiping his hands on his jeans. "I'm just glad I could help." Tears welled up in Mrs. Garcia's eyes as she gazed at him, her heart full of gratitude. "Thank you, Chris. You have no idea how much this means to me," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This TV, it was a gift from my late husband. I thought I'd lost it forever." Her voice trailed off as she glanced at the TV, a tender memory clearly resurfacing in her mind. Chris's heart ached at the thought of Mrs. Garcia's loss. He hadn't realized how much the TV meant to her, or how deeply her husband's passing had affected her. Mrs. Garcia, her face lighting up with a sudden thought, smiled warmly at him. "You know, Chris, I just baked some fresh cookies this morning. Would you like to come inside and have some? It's the least I can do to thank you." Chris's eyes sparkled at the mention of cookies. "That sounds great, Mrs. Garcia. Thank you so much." As they walked toward the house, Mrs. Garcia placed a gentle hand on Chris's shoulder. "You're a very special young man, Chris," she said softly. "Your parents must be so proud of you." Chris smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. He hadn't just fixed a TV today, he had brought a smile to Mrs. Garcia's face, and that made everything worth it. She had thanked him so many times already, but to him, it was enough simply to see her happy again. When they stepped inside, Mrs. Garcia led him to the kitchen, where the scent of freshly baked chocolate chip cookies filled the air. The kitchen was cozy, the walls adorned with faded photographs and colorful plates. As she set down a plate of warm cookies in front of him, Chris couldn't help but marvel at how good they smelled. "Here you go, dear," Mrs. Garcia said, her eyes twinkling with joy. "Enjoy." Chris took a bite, the gooey chocolate chips melting in his mouth. "These are amazing, Mrs. Garcia," he exclaimed, his voice muffled by the cookie. Mrs. Garcia laughed, her face glowing with happiness. "I'm so glad you like them, Chris. It's been a while since I've had someone to bake for." They sat together at the kitchen table, chatting about everything and nothing. Mrs. Garcia shared stories about her late husband, Robert, a police officer who had served the community with pride. Chris listened intently, his heart full of compassion as he realized just how much Mrs. Garcia missed him. The loneliness that had clouded her days became more apparent with every word she spoke. As Chris finished the last cookie, Mrs. Garcia smiled at him, a sense of peace settling over her. "You've made my day, Chris," she said softly. "Thank you for everything. You're always welcome here, anytime. I always have cookies, and I could use the company." Chris grinned, his heart light. "I'd love to visit you again, Mrs. Garcia. I'll be back soon." As he made his way back outside, a deep sense of fulfillment washed over him. He hadn't just helped fix a TV, he had touched someone's life in a way that would stay with them both forever. Little did he know, this simple act of kindness would set in motion a series of events that would change his life in ways he could never have imagined. The unexpected visitor. The next morning, Chris woke up early, his mind still buzzing with the warmth of yesterday's experience. He had never expected something as simple as helping Mrs. Garcia with her broken television would have such a profound effect on him. The cookies, the stories, the feeling of having truly made a difference in someone's life, it all made him feel proud in a way he had never felt before. As he dressed for the day, he couldn't help but look forward to visiting her again, eager to check in on her and perhaps share another moment of kindness. After breakfast, Chris grabbed his bike and set out down the street. The morning air was crisp, and the streets were quiet, bathed in the soft light of the early sun. As he neared Mrs. Garcia's house, he saw her tending to her flower garden, her frail hands gently pulling weeds from around the colorful blooms. Her face was serene, and for the first time in a long while, she seemed at peace. Chris parked his bike on the side of the road and made his way up the walkway, the crunch of gravel under his shoes the only sound breaking the silence. Mrs. Garcia looked up as he approached, a smile lighting up her face. "Chris! What a lovely surprise," she called out, her voice warm and inviting. "I wasn't expecting you so soon." "I wanted to check on you," Chris said with a smile, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "I was hoping the TV is still working well." Mrs. Garcia's eyes crinkled with joy. "It's working perfectly, dear. You did such a wonderful job fixing it. I don't know what I would have done without you." She stood up from her gardening, brushing her hands on her apron, and waved him inside. "Why don't you come in for a bit? I made some lemonade." Chris followed her into the house, the familiar scent of freshly baked cookies and flowers lingering in the air. The living room was cozy, with soft light filtering through the curtains. As they walked inside, Chris couldn't help but notice more framed photos of a younger Mrs. Garcia and her husband. In one photo, she stood proudly beside him, her arm around his waist, both smiling as they posed in front of a police car. It struck Chris that he had never really known much about Mrs. Garcia's life, beyond her love for gardening and television. "Please, make yourself comfortable," Mrs. Garcia said as she gestured to the floral-patterned sofa. "I'll be right back with the lemonade." Chris sat down, his mind still buzzing with curiosity. He noticed a photo of a younger Mrs. Garcia with her husband in their prime, standing proudly in front of a police car. He had always known that Mrs. Garcia had been married to a police officer, but seeing the photo made him wonder more about her life, the love story she shared with Robert, and the kind of woman she had been before her husband's passing. When Mrs. Garcia returned with 2 glasses of lemonade, Chris politely accepted one, savoring the cool, refreshing taste. He couldn't help but ask, "Is that your husband in the photo?" He gestured toward the framed picture on the mantel. Mrs. Garcia's expression softened, her eyes growing misty. She placed her glass on the table, the glass sweating in the warm air of the room. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "That's Robert. He was a good man, a brave man. He served this community for over 30 years. We were so proud of him." Chris could see the love in her eyes as she spoke of him. The years may have passed since Robert's death, but he was clearly still a presence in her life. Mrs. Garcia paused for a moment, and Chris noticed a shadow cross her face. "It's been hard without him," she continued, her voice soft. "He was my rock, you know? The world just doesn't feel as bright without him around." Chris felt a pang of sympathy for her. He knew what it was like to lose someone close, though he couldn't imagine the depth of her loss after decades of marriage. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Garcia," he said quietly. "I can't imagine how hard it must be." She gave him a small smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you, Chris. It's just, the days feel long sometimes, especially when there's no one to talk to. I never thought I'd feel so alone, but here we are." Chris nodded, his heart heavy with understanding. "You're not alone, Mrs. Garcia," he said earnestly. "You have me. And I'm always happy to visit." She looked at him, her expression softening. "You're a good boy, Chris. I'm very grateful for your kindness." She paused for a moment before continuing, "You know, Robert always believed in helping people. He would have liked you. He always said that even the smallest acts of kindness could make the biggest difference." He was right. Chris smiled at the thought of Robert and his dedication to service. He could see the deep respect and love Mrs. Garcia had for her late husband, and it made him realize just how important those little acts of kindness truly were. They chatted for a while longer, with Mrs. Garcia sharing more stories about her life with Robert, about their adventures together, and about his years in the police force. Chris was fascinated by her stories, feeling honored to be a part of her memories. But as the conversation continued, the atmosphere in the house shifted. It wasn't just the stories or the memories that lingered in the air, it was something more. Something Chris couldn't quite place. Mrs. Garcia seemed uneasy, her gaze occasionally flicking toward the window as if she were waiting for something, or someone. Before Chris could ask her about it, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the moment. Mrs. Garcia's expression changed almost instantly. Her brow furrowed, and she stood up, her hands clasped tightly together. Chris looked toward the window, where a police car had just parked in front of the house. He saw the figure of a police officer getting out of the car, his uniform sharp in the midday light. "Mrs. Garcia, is everything okay?" Chris asked, a knot forming in his stomach. Mrs. Garcia's face was pale, and for a moment, Chris saw a flicker of fear in her eyes. "Oh, dear," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "It's just, this is unexpected. I wasn't expecting him to show up today." Chris stood up, confused. "Who is it? What's going on?" Mrs. Garcia didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a deep breath and walked toward the door. Chris followed her, his mind racing with questions. What was going on? Why was the police officer here? And why did Mrs. Garcia seem so worried? When they opened the door, the officer stood there, his face neutral, but serious. "Mrs. Garcia?" he asked, his tone professional. "Yes, that's me," Mrs. Garcia replied, her voice trembling slightly. "Can I help you, officer?" The officer glanced over at Chris, who was standing just behind Mrs. Garcia, looking concerned. He didn't seem to recognize the young boy, and for a moment, the officer's expression softened. "I'm Officer Reynolds. I'm afraid I need to ask you a few questions, Mrs. Garcia." Chris could feel the tension in the air. Mrs. Garcia looked back at him, her eyes wide, and it dawned on him that whatever was happening, it wasn't something she had anticipated. "Is everything okay?" Chris asked, his voice full of worry. Mrs. Garcia turned to him, a look of hesitation in her eyes. She didn't want to drag him into whatever was going on, but Chris could see that something was wrong. This wasn't just a routine visit. He could feel it. Something was about to unfold that would change everything. "Chris," Mrs. Garcia began, her voice soft but firm, "you might want to go inside for a moment. I'll explain everything soon, I promise." Chris stood frozen for a moment, staring at the officer and then back at Mrs. Garcia. He had helped her yesterday, and he couldn't just walk away now. Something didn't feel right, and his gut was telling him that he needed to stay and find out what was happening. As the officer spoke to Mrs. Garcia, his words blurred together in Chris's mind. The only thing he could focus on was one simple truth: his life was about to change in a way he could never have predicted. And it all started with that one small act of kindness. What was going to happen next? And what role would Chris play in the story that was about to unfold? The unraveling truth. The air in Mrs. Garcia's living room was thick with uncertainty, and Chris couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. As he watched the police officer, Officer Reynolds, speak with Mrs. Garcia, his mind raced with questions. Why was the officer here? What had brought him to Mrs. Garcia's home, and why was she so unsettled? His eyes darted from the officer to Mrs. Garcia, but he could tell that neither of them was willing to explain just yet. Chris felt a deep unease in the pit of his stomach. Mrs. Garcia had asked him to go inside, but Chris was having none of it. He wasn't about to walk away when it was clear that something important was unfolding. He stepped closer to the door, trying to catch snippets of the conversation. The officer's voice was firm but not unkind, and Mrs. Garcia's tone was low, almost pleading. "Mrs. Garcia," Officer Reynolds said, his voice sharp, "you're certain about this? We've checked all the records, and it's very clear. There's no mistake." Chris couldn't make out her response, but he saw her face tighten with concern, her lips pressing into a thin line. It wasn't like the friendly, warm expression Chris was used to seeing on Mrs. Garcia. Something had shaken her, and it was more than just the officer's presence. I don't understand, Chris said, stepping forward, unable to contain his curiosity any longer. What's going on? Why is he here, Mrs. Garcia? Mrs. Garcia turned to him slowly, her eyes full of both surprise and reluctance. Chris, she began, her voice shaking slightly, I wasn't expecting this. Please, just give me a moment to explain. The officer turned his gaze toward Chris, his expression unreadable. It's best if you stay inside, young man, he said in a calm but firm voice. This is an investigation, and it's important that Mrs. Garcia and I speak privately for now. Chris's heart pounded in his chest, and he wasn't sure if it was from fear or something else. He knew Mrs. Garcia had been kind to him, she had baked him cookies, shared her stories, and even talked about her late husband. She had been lonely, yes, but she had always been warm and welcoming. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story, something she hadn't shared with him yet. Don't worry, Chris, Mrs. Garcia said softly, her eyes still on him as she took a slow, measured breath. I'll explain everything soon. Just trust me. Though her words were meant to comfort him, Chris could sense the heaviness in her voice, the uncertainty that weighed on her shoulders. He nodded slowly, reluctantly stepping back into the living room as Mrs. Garcia and Officer Reynolds continued their conversation outside. Minutes felt like hours as Chris sat there, anxiously staring at the door, waiting for some sort of resolution. His mind raced with 100 different scenarios. Had Mrs. Garcia been involved in something illegal? Was this about her late husband? Had there been some kind of misunderstanding? The longer he waited, the more questions piled up in his mind. What did Mrs. Garcia really know about the officer's visit? Why had she looked so afraid? These were not the thoughts he had expected to have when he first set out to help her fix her television. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the door creaked open. Mrs. Garcia walked in, but she was no longer the warm, friendly woman who had greeted Chris just an hour ago. Her shoulders were slumped, and her face looked drained of color. She looked older somehow, worn by a burden Chris had never seen before. The officer stood in the doorway for a moment, his eyes scanning the room before he turned and left without another word. The sound of the car's engine starting and fading into the distance echoed in Chris's ears. The tension in the house seemed to lift slightly, but only for a moment. Mrs. Garcia took a seat on the sofa, her hands trembling in her lap. Chris sat across from her, his eyes wide with concern. The words he had been waiting for were finally coming, but he wasn't prepared for what she would say next. Chris, she began, her voice unsteady, I know you must be confused, and I owe you an explanation. You see, this isn't about the TV. Not really. She paused, her gaze dropping to her hands. It's about something much bigger. Something from my past that I've been hiding for a long time. Chris felt his heart rate quicken. He had been right. Mrs. Garcia wasn't just an elderly woman in need of a television repair. There was something deeper at play here, something that had been weighing on her for years, and now it seemed as though it was finally coming to light. I don't know where to begin, Mrs. Garcia said, her voice breaking. Years ago, when Robert was still alive, we got caught up in something that we never should have. It was during his time on the force. A case he was investigating. It was something that should have never gone public, something that he and I both thought we could keep quiet. But the truth is, Chris, we couldn't escape it. And now, it's come back. Chris was silent, not knowing how to respond. Mrs. Garcia's words felt like a revelation, each one sending a ripple of disbelief through him. What had she been involved in? What was this case? And why hadn't she told him sooner? Why had she been carrying this burden alone for so long? Mrs. Garcia took a deep breath before continuing, as though gathering the strength to face her own demons. There was an investigation into corruption within the police department. Robert was getting too close to something that, well, it could have destroyed everything. He found out that some officers were involved in illegal activities that went far beyond what any officer should ever be a part of. And he didn't want to stay quiet about it. He didn't want to cover it up. But he was getting threats. And one day, he didn't come home. They said it was a car accident, but I never believed that. Chris's mind reeled. He had known Mrs. Garcia had lost her husband, but he had always assumed it was natural causes, or at worst, a tragic accident. The thought that Robert had been involved in a conspiracy, a cover-up, this was a completely different story. It wasn't the one Chris had expected to hear. Mrs. Garcia continued, her voice growing steadier as she shared the rest of the story. Robert's death wasn't an accident. He was murdered. And I've spent all these years trying to keep it hidden, trying to protect myself, to protect his memory. But now, with everything coming to light, the police are reopening the case. They think there's more to it, and they're looking into what really happened. Chris sat there, stunned. He couldn't quite process everything he was hearing. Mrs. Garcia's husband, a police officer, had been murdered, and now the investigation was being revived? It was all so overwhelming. And now you're involved, Mrs. Garcia said, looking up at Chris, her eyes filled with guilt. The police are asking about people who might know more, people who were close to Robert. They're questioning anyone who might have had information, and because you helped me, you've become a part of this story. Chris felt the weight of her words. He had never imagined that his simple act of kindness, helping her fix her television, would entangle him in something so dangerous, so complex. He had only wanted to help her, to be kind and bring a little joy into her life. Now, it seemed, his world was about to be turned upside down. I'm so sorry, Chris, Mrs. Garcia said, her voice trembling. I didn't mean for you to get caught up in this. But now, you're a part of it. And I need you to understand that there's no going back. This isn't just about a broken TV anymore. This is about justice, about uncovering the truth, no matter how dangerous it might be. Chris stood up slowly, his mind racing. What was he supposed to do now? Could he help her? Should he walk away from it all? Or should he stand by Mrs. Garcia, the woman who had trusted him enough to share her deepest secret? He looked at her, his heart heavy with both fear and determination. He had to make a choice. Mrs. Garcia, he said quietly, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm not going to walk away. I'll help you. Whatever it takes. The unlikely heroes. The next few days were a blur of uncertainty. Chris couldn't stop thinking about Mrs. Garcia, the police officer's visit, and the shocking revelation that her husband had been murdered years ago. What started as a simple act of kindness, helping Mrs. Garcia fix her television, had spiraled into something far larger and far more dangerous. Now, Chris found himself caught up in a mystery that went beyond anything he could have imagined. He wasn't sure what to do, but he knew one thing for certain, Mrs. Garcia needed him. And in a way, he needed her too. She had always been a steady presence in his life, offering him cookies and stories from the past. Now it was time for him to be the one to offer something back. But helping her meant venturing into unknown and potentially dangerous territory. Chris spent his days going over every detail of what Mrs. Garcia had shared with him. Robert Garcia had been an officer in the local police force, a man of honor who had stumbled upon corruption that he couldn't ignore. His pursuit of justice had cost him his life. And now, years later, those responsible were still out there, their actions covered up, their crimes hidden. Mrs. Garcia had spent all this time trying to protect her husband's name, trying to keep the truth buried because she knew it would bring danger. But now that the investigation was being reopened, it seemed like the truth was coming out whether they were ready for it or not. Chris knew it was bigger than him, bigger than Mrs. Garcia. But what could one teenager do in the face of something so monumental? He thought about the conversations he had with his parents. His mom and dad were always so supportive, so encouraging, but he could tell they didn't fully understand the weight of the situation. They had always taught him to do the right thing, to stand up for what was right, but this was something entirely different. This wasn't just about fixing a TV or helping an elderly neighbor. This was about uncovering a dark, hidden truth that had the power to change everything. One evening, Chris sat in his room, staring out of his window. The setting sun cast an orange glow over the street, painting the neighborhood in shades of warmth and nostalgia. He could still see the image of Mrs. Garcia, sitting in her living room, trembling as she spoke of her husband's murder. Her eyes, filled with both sorrow and regret, haunted him. He couldn't just walk away. He wouldn't. Mrs. Garcia had been kind to him when others hadn't. She had trusted him with her story, her pain, and now it was time for him to step up, to be her ally in the face of danger. But he had no idea where to begin. Then, as if by fate, the answer came to him. It was a Saturday afternoon when Chris decided to take action. He knew he couldn't solve everything on his own, but he could help Mrs. Garcia get the support she needed. He didn't have connections, and he didn't have any special skills. What he did have was determination and the resolve to make a difference. He would go to the one person who might be able to help, someone who understood the world of justice, someone who had the resources and the ability to investigate the corruption within the police force. Chris had never spoken to Officer Reynolds before, but he knew he had to try. So, he got on his bike, his heart racing as he pedaled toward the police station. At the station, Chris stood outside for a few moments, gathering his thoughts. His palms were sweating, and his mind raced with what to say. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. But he knew that if he didn't act now, he might regret it forever. He walked up to the entrance and, with a deep breath, pushed open the door. Inside, the station was bustling with activity. Officers were on phones, filing paperwork, and talking amongst themselves. It felt like a different world from the quiet suburban streets he was used to. He approached the front desk, where an officer was sitting, typing away at a computer. "Excuse me," Chris said, his voice shaking slightly. I need to speak to Officer Reynolds." The officer at the desk looked up, her face unreadable. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but it's important," Chris said, his voice gaining strength. I know something about the Garcia case, and I need to speak to him." The officer eyed him suspiciously but seemed to recognize the urgency in Chris's tone. After a long pause, she nodded. "I'll let him know you're here." Chris sat in the waiting area, tapping his foot nervously. His mind was racing with all the things he needed to say, all the information he needed to share. But what if Officer Reynolds didn't believe him? What if he thought Chris was just a kid playing hero? A few minutes later, Officer Reynolds appeared, his expression as stern as ever. "Chris Johnson," he said, his tone flat. "I wasn't expecting you." Chris stood up, trying to hide the nervousness in his voice. I know you're investigating the Garcia case. I can help. I know things about Mrs. Garcia and her husband." Reynolds looked at him for a moment, then gestured for him to follow. "Let's talk." They walked into a small office at the back of the station, and Chris sat down across from the officer. He took a deep breath before beginning. "Mrs. Garcia's husband, Robert," Chris began, his voice steady but his heart pounding. "He was investigating corruption in the police department before he died. He uncovered something bad. And now, people are trying to cover it up." Officer Reynolds listened intently, his expression unreadable. Chris went on, telling the officer everything Mrs. Garcia had told him, how Robert had been a good man, a man who had wanted to bring justice, and how he had been murdered because of it. Chris didn't know all the details, but he knew enough to make his case. When he finished, there was silence between them. Officer Reynolds leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping on the desk. Chris waited anxiously, wondering if he had said too much, or not enough. Finally, Reynolds spoke. "You're not wrong, Chris," he said, his voice low. "There was corruption. There is corruption. But you need to understand, kid, it's deeper than you think. This isn't just about a few bad apples. This is about a system that's been in place for years. And it's going to take more than one kid to bring it down." Chris felt a pang of uncertainty in his chest. "But I can help. I have to help." Reynolds looked at him, his gaze softening slightly. "You're brave, Chris. I'll give you that. But be careful. This is dangerous. You're not just fighting against the system, you're fighting against people who don't want the truth to come out. But you're right about one thing, we need the truth. And if you're willing to stick with it, maybe we can do something. Chris nodded, feeling the weight of the officer's words. He had no idea what was to come, but he knew this was just the beginning. With Officer Reynolds' help, he could bring justice to Mrs. Garcia's husband, Robert. And maybe, just maybe, they could expose the corruption that had destroyed his life. The days that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and covert investigations. Chris worked alongside Officer Reynolds, Mrs. Garcia, and a few trusted individuals who were also committed to uncovering the truth. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when it seemed like the weight of the world was on their shoulders. But Chris never gave up. His determination to help Mrs. Garcia and honor her late husband kept him going, even when things seemed hopeless. The truth came out slowly, piece by piece. They uncovered evidence, traced connections, and followed leads. It wasn't long before they had enough to bring the corruption to light. In the end, the truth was exposed, and justice was finally served. The officers responsible were held accountable, and the corruption within the department was rooted out. Mrs. Garcia, though scarred by the past, found peace. She knew that her husband's memory had been honored and that his death had not been in vain. She had fought for him, and with Chris's help, she had won. And as for Chris, he learned that sometimes, doing the right thing wasn't easy. It was messy, complicated, and dangerous. But in the end, it was worth it. He had helped a neighbor, uncovered a hidden truth, and made a difference in the world. The journey had changed him forever, and he knew he would never be the same again.